That bike for sure would not make that jump. If he was to try and jump that for real, with the ground clearance the way it is and the weight of that bike, I think both wheels would come off and the engine would just drop straight out the bottom. Hey GQ, my name's Rick English, I'm a stunt performer, and this is the breakdown. First up, John Wick, Chapter 3, Parabellum. Okay, so it looks like these guys are riding pretty regular naked sports bikes. I think it looks like a 900cc Yamaha. For this type of sequence where they're going to be using weapons, it's good to have a bike like that where you've got an upright riding position. If you're on something a bit more extreme, a sports bike, you'd be a lot more hunched forward. It'd be a little bit more difficult to sit up and draw those weapons with that. I wouldn't have thought that these bikes would be specially made or custom made for this sequence. The only thing you might do is change the gearing slightly because you're not using the top speed of the bike at all. That bike as standard will probably do like 160, 170 miles an hour, and you don't need all that speed, so you can gear that bike down so that the power is used, make it more responsive on the bottom end. And it's definitely way more useful for film stuff generally than to have a real fast top speed. It looked really smooth actually. It looks doable. And when you're doing transfers for motorcycles, is the instability. If you were transferring from a car to another car, it doesn't matter if you push off of that car with your foot, you're not going to send the car sideways. A motorcycle though, if you push off sideways on the bike, chances are that bike will tip over. And the slower you're going, the worse that'll be. And the more that'd be exaggerated. The way it was there, it's kind of high speed. It was very slick. It looks like he's practiced that 1,000 times. And I would say that was probably done in a volume on a sound stage against green screen or something like that. So that was a pretty spectacular crash we had there. I'd say it would be difficult to do that practically. I'd want a lot of money to do that practically. 400 pounds landing on top of the guy there. So I would say that's probably some digital help with that one there. And because they don't stay on it too long, any kind of discrepancies between real action and anything CG and enhanced, because you're cutting away and it's quite a fast moving clip, you can get away with that pretty well. Real attention to detail for me with the riding there. Keanu, the main character, seems to be performing a lot of the fight moves with his left hand, and that's obviously because the primary controls on your bike are on your right hand. You've got your throttle there, you've got your front brake there, so you take that hand off of the bike, you're really limiting how much control you have. So you'll see even when he starts to use his right hand for fight beats, he puts his left hand onto the bar just so he can keep the throttle open and the bike doesn't shut off. We've got to say they've probably taken a bit of artistic license there. If something went into your back wheel, your bike wouldn't flip like that, to be honest. The opposite thing would happen. The rear wheel would lock up and the bike would slow down from the rear, so it would probably dive forwards if anything. The only way it would kind of flip like that was if the guy still had his hand on the throttle and then it caused him to hit the gas really hard. That could cause the bike to spin out backwards like that. So I'll say that's probably what happened in that clip there, and that's what they were going for. But it's a big deal to film on location. There's a lot involved, a lot of different departments that have to all come together. I think they filmed a lot of stuff on the stage, especially the fight beats, like on a green screen, and then captured the camera background shots and plate shots to overlay that onto later on. I won't say a simpler way of doing it, but it's just a much more effective way of doing it. To actually film those fight beats on location, on the bridge like that, almost impossible. That's done really well. That end sequence all looks to be in camera. Practical stunts, I would say that's a stunt double for sure, the doubling for Keanu. I know he's mega into bikes, he's a great rider, but there's no reason to risk an actor for a sequence like that. He's got no helmet on, he's riding on wet roads, he adds challenges then with grip for tires and stuff. So at the end, two nice crashes. The first one was like a lay down crash. We just call it a regular bike lay down or low side, and what that is where the rear tire slips away and the rider will hit the floor and the bike will slide away from them. And that was the first guy, the bad guy rider. And then the other crash that you saw Keanu's character do there is what we call a high side. And what happens there is the bike slips away, but it flicks the rider over the top of the bike or the high side of the bike. They're the two main kinds of motorcycle crashes. And it's really cool that they got those two to happen in one shot. And I thought that looked awesome. And next up, Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. I worked on this movie. I'm actually the bad guy that's chasing Ilsa on the motorcycles. This was filmed in Morocco. It was a disused motorway just outside of Marrakesh. It was all completely closed down specifically for the movie to shoot there. So the bikes we used on this chase were 1000cc sports bikes, BMW S1000RR. It's a powerful bike straight out of the box. That thing's nearly 200 horsepower, capable of almost 200 miles an hour as standard, so it was perfect for what we're doing on here. Most of the stuff in and out of the trucks that you see here, it was all done practically. The trucks are really there, the cars are really there. That's myself, the other riders, and TC all riding. We planned every shot out and every route out so everyone knew exactly where they were going, because obviously at that kind of speed, you just can't afford any mistakes. First thing Tom does is pick up the sunglasses before he gets on the bike. That's actually quite important because traveling this kind of speed, you need eye protection. When you're doing speeds of, you know, 100 miles an hour, you don't want to get a stone or anything thrown up into the eye at that kind of speed. And so really important to have eye protection. Even just the wind blast at that kind of speed, you'd be struggling to see anything over sort of 40, 50 miles an hour. And you'll see him leaning really far forward on the bike here. That keeps the weight at the front of the bike. So the bike's designed like that. It's a race bike essentially, designed to do high speeds. So the rider wants to be as aerodynamic as possible. So he's fully tucked in on that bike. You know, if you were on a naked bike doing that kind of speed, the wind would just be blasting in your face and trying to rip you off the back of that. If the cars are doing motorway speeds, you know, 60, 70 miles an hour, then to make the chase through there look fast, you would have to be doing 140, 150 miles an hour. So it's just not practical. So you just back the cars off a little bit, slow their speeds down, say maybe 30 miles an hour. And then when the bikes come through there at 70, 80 miles an hour, the speed differential makes it feel so much faster and gives a lot more energy to the chase. Tom's really keen to do as much as he can. The sequences are written for him specifically in mind that he's going to be performing this by himself. He likes to do his own stunts. Rehearsing and practicing, I literally was looking down at my speedo going, yeah, that's Tom right in front of me and he's doing 130 miles an hour right now. There's not many actors I know that have that level of skill and would be prepared to do that for their movies. You saw Ilsa there change up a gear. You could see that through the way she pulled the clutch in with her left hand. Now, to be honest, these bikes and a lot of modern sports bikes will have a quick shifter system, so you don't actually have to use the clutch to knock it up a gear. You can just literally hold the throttle wide open and kick the gear shifter, and that'll change the bike up a gear without using the clutch. But for films, it helps to illustrate the point that she's increasing her speed. They're wearing full race leathers, which suit these bikes perfectly. They'll have plastic pucks on their knees, and that's literally so they can touch the knee on the floor, and that just gives you an extra point of stability. It also helps you to gauge your lean angle. For this chase, although the bikes weren't really modified too much, we did add a little bit of crash protection on there. I think most race bikes these days, it's mandatory to have this little plastic guard that covers the end of the right handlebar. And what that does is if you make contact with another rider, it just stops that front brake from being jammed on. Because we just had one instance during rehearsal where we were rehearsing a couple of the bikes banging into each other, seeing how that looked. Yeah, one of the other riders came into me, his front brake lever hit my leg and it hit his brake straight away and it was close to disaster. So we just put those little guards on there to stop that happening when we were filming. I would say it took us probably 6 weeks total to actually film once we got to Morocco, and then a couple of months rehearsal back in the UK before we headed out there. Still amazing roads to ride. No room for mistakes on those roads either. You know, the bike goes down and it's off the edge of a cliff. So everybody had to really concentrate and be careful. That was practical. I did that crash myself. I remember a couple of weeks Before we headed out to Morocco, myself and the coordinator and second unit director are all big motorcycle racing fans, and there'd been some racing on the week before. We'd seen some spectacular crash by one of the MotoGP riders, and we kind of came together and said it'd be nice if we could do something like that rather than just let the bike slide out when Tom knocks us off. That's what we ended up doing. You see the bike slide away once I've been flicked over the top, and it goes off at the edge of the mountain, and special effects blew it up afterwards. It would definitely shake you up, but yeah, totally survivable. Happens every day in racing. Obviously Tom isn't wearing a helmet there, so just when you're tumbling, you would just be making sure that, that your head was protected. I certainly would be. Really well done, pretty realistic. Yeah, I mean, Mission was a dream job for me. We had a bunch of the greatest riders in the world, amazing landscape, beautiful roads. It's not very often that you get to do a chase on actual sports bikes. They're not used that much for chase stuff because the roads kind of have to be flat and straight, but they're great for doing high speed stuff, and I thought it came out really well. I was so pleased to be involved with it. Next up, Skyfall.
Yes, Mom.
I worked on this movie. These bikes were Honda CRF 250 four-stroke motocross bikes. This was filmed in the main square in Istanbul in Turkey. Obviously those bikes have to look like they belong there. So the bike the bad guy's escaping on there, motocross bike dressed as a police bike. Bond is basically riding exactly the same model of motorcycle, but this time it's dressed like you were going backpacking across the country or something. Everything is mapped out beforehand, and the routes have to be planned carefully. A mixture of stunt performers and background artists. We can get them crossing at the right times to make everything look as chaotic as possible, but keep everybody as safe as possible. The stunt guy that's backing that vehicle up, he'll have a specific mark where he's not going to go past as well until the ride is cleared. But there's a lot of trust there between the two of them that he'll just floor the bike, make the gap, and the stunt guy reversing that car will be there at the right time. These off-road bikes are perfectly capable of that, no modifications at all. You see when he goes up the stairs there, kind of cut to the outside a little bit. The stairs were a little bit less severe, a little bit more worn away at the side there, so that's probably the route I would have taken as well, rather than just going straight up the middle there. These guys, two of the most skilled riders in the world, making this look amazing. All practical, all done for real, on location, on actual rooftops in Turkey. You have to plan every part of this route, because if you go onto the wrong part of those rooftops, they're real rooftops and they're not meant to take the weight of a motorcycle jumping onto them. So the path of each bike was planned precisely. This was filmed a few years ago, and it's kind of before drones became a mainstream way of filming photography. So a lot of this rooftop section was filmed from another motorcycle with a camera mounted on the front. And again, that's another world level rider there, and they did amazingly well. On this movie, this was one of the first times that I kind of saw extensive use of face replacement, replacing a stunt performer's face with the face of an actor. So they would put tracking markers on the stunt performer's face at specific points, and then they would track the actor's face image onto those points afterwards, so you can actually get the actor into that scene. I think it's done really well in this movie. It was one of the first times I'd seen it. In the story, it makes sense that the guys don't wear helmets. Obviously that presents risks for the performers. One way to minimize that risk is to use a skull cap, which would be like a carbon fiber cap that's molded specifically to each performer's head. A wig can then be attached to the outside of that, or latex to make the skin and stuff, and it will give you know, more protection than nothing. It's not the same as wearing a helmet, but it just gives you a little bit of protection there. And we can then kind of sort out any problems with that afterwards in post. I was there, I was in the bazaar when the bikes came in and landed there, and that was done completely for real. The glass is obviously a breakaway sugar type glass, but yeah, the whole thing was completely practical, and those guys had to jump those bikes. It was about, I think, like a 14-foot drop between the top and the bottom, too flat. Rehearsed it onto a down ramp to line the shot up so you weren't risking the riders and the bikes until the cameras are rolling, and then once the cameras are rolling, the guys just went for it. Again, these sections where it's slightly lower speed, you can afford to put the actors in there. The people along the side, they'll be stunt performers. They're aware that there are bikes coming through there, and they may get told to, you know, step out and then step back in at the last second as if they're reacting to a bike coming through and keeping everything pretty natural. That would have obviously been a stunt performer, and it was done in a couple of different parts, I think. I think they rode the bike in and then had the guy on a wire and just sent him over. I totally buy that the bike would flip over like that. It depends how high the barrier is. Basically, when we do this, if we hit a car or something like that with a bike, it kind of depends on how much of the weight of the bike is above and below. If there's more of the weight of the bike is below the surface it's hitting, then it's just going to get stopped dead pretty much. But if there's enough momentum and the barrier is low enough or the bridge is low enough, then as soon as the wheel hits it, the rider and the bike are going to get flipped over the top like that. And I thought it was done pretty well. Yeah, for any stunt guy, I mean, the pinnacle is kind of working on a Bond movie, so to be involved in a small way in an epic chase like that for me was great fun, and to be there and watch it all unfold was amazing. Next up, The Dark Knight. I thought this was a pretty cool idea actually. The only kind of limitation you've got with that is that then obviously you've got these big fat car tires essentially on a motorcycle, so it's never really going to turn that well or handle that well, but looks cool. Mainly filmed, I think, on location in Chicago. The Bat bike itself was ridden by a French stunt rider called Jean-Pierre Goy, an amazing rider. And it's very challenging, to be honest. Like I say, the tires are such crazy, big, fat, square profile tires that thing will only pretty much go in a straight line. You'll see a lot of the sequences, the bike's staying pretty much straight, and then, you know, he's only able to make these kind of shallow turns. That thing wouldn't be able to turn sharp at all. Okay, so one of the other challenges that the stunt guy would have had there riding this bike is the cape. Once you're actually at speed, that cape's flying out behind you, the wind's catching it, and it's lifted away from the wheels. As soon as you would want to slow down to a slower speed and the cape starts to drop, you got to think that thing's going to be wanting to tangle up in the back wheel, and that could definitely cause a problem and cause you to crash that bike. Okay, so this is interesting. Through the shopping mall there, like I say, we're making kind of smooth turns. That's a very slippery surface, as anybody would know. And one of the things that we do sometimes on slippery surfaces like that, where we're going to drive vehicles through them, is we actually use Coca-Cola, and they would spray a thin spray of Coca-Cola on the floor there and let it dry, and it would become sticky and tacky. And sometimes that's the only way you can get any grip on vehicles. Yeah, you see, as he makes those turns, that bike is literally on the edge of that tire. It takes a lot of skill to hold that and to keep it balanced on the sides of those tires. I'm guessing that's a CG element. Obviously the bike came through the wall, breakaway wall, but the bike kind of slid to a stop and it looked like the front wheel kind of rotated around itself. And it's Batman. I'll let him off with that, with some artistic license there. If that was for real, then that's amazing. It can definitely be done, but it's a very risky thing to do. Obviously, we've seen it in Fast and Furious with cars done practically, but with that bike, I'm guessing with the instability of it and everything, I would say that was probably done as a plate shot. So they would have shot the two elements, shot the truck going along by itself, then shot the bike in the same location, going along the path it needed to take, and then just comped the two of them together in post. The closest thing to a real bike that exists like that, that's probably would be like a drag bike, has that same kind of geometry, a real stretched out look, and they're made for just going fast in straight lines, which is pretty much exactly what this bike does in this movie. But these bikes were actually practical. They were built for real. I think they had 4 or 5 of them that the special effects department built. I'm not sure how fast they were, and I think they were a handful to ride, but yeah, that was a real bike. Like with the cars, there's a lot of electric vehicles coming out now. We've started using those in movies as well and stuff. And there's advantages and disadvantages of those. The main problem we have these days with vehicles, cars and bikes, when the newer the vehicle, the more sensors and safety technology is incorporated into the newer designs. And so when you want to abuse them and slide them and crash them and do stoppies and lift one wheel up and that kind of thing, everything on that bike or that car is telling you not to do that and trying to stop riders from doing that. So you have to either be able to switch all of that stuff off or disable it or trick the bike into letting you play with it a little bit. We tried to do that, not exactly that, but spin a bike around on its rear wheel like that on another movie that we did, and we did it by having a cable overhead, and I would kind of wheelie the bike and let them take the weight and then pivot it around itself, but it ends up kind of clunky. That looks really nice and really smooth, so again, that's got to be a CG takeover. It's not something you could really do practically. It'll be hard work. I think most of this was shot practically, to be honest. There's not really a lot of places here where you need to put the green screen elements in there. There aren't beats of the actor on the motorcycle or anything that we've got to put in there or put his face in there because, you know, he has the cowl. Pretty much this would have been practical with the stunt rider the whole time, I would guess. Next up, Terminator 2, Judgment Day. This movie is quite a few years old now, but for me this chase still stands up. Yeah, so Ed Furlong there riding like a small dirt bike, 100cc Honda, something like that. And then Arnie, big guy, big bike, Harley fat boy, something like that. He's got a nice relaxed riding position there as well, which enables him to use his weapon and all stuff while he's riding. One of the challenges you're always going to have when there's a kid riding a motorcycle is you're going to need a stunt performer to double that kid for all the action sequences. That means you're going to have a stunt performer that's the same size as a child, basically. So I'm pretty sure that what they did for this movie was they used a stunt performer, you know, as small as they could get, but then because they were still larger than Ed Furlong, the actor, they had to use a motorcycle that was slightly bigger, so they probably used, you know, a 125 or, you know, 200cc motorcycle, so that in perspective it looked the same size. Pretty clever way of doing it, to be honest, and the audience would never know. The bike that he's on there, it's like a kid's dirt bike, but they're not toys. That's a real motorcycle, so that thing will probably do 60 or 70 miles an hour. Could outrun that truck for sure. I definitely would not want to be nudged in the back wheel by a big truck like that. I think you would probably go down the first time that thing touched you, and you'd be under that truck. But they sold it pretty well. That bike for sure would not make that jump. If he was to try and jump that for real, with the ground clearance the way it is and the weight of that bike, I think both wheels would come off and the engine would just drop straight out the bottom. It was done practically on wires, I believe, and so they're obviously suspending the weight of the bike on there. If you were jumping a bike and using like a motocross bike, something that's set up specifically for jumping, then the suspension has got a long travel and it's going to absorb a lot of that shock. With that bike, I reckon it's probably got this much travel before hard parts of that bike are hitting the floor and all that shock could be sent through you, and that would hurt, probably break your ankles, and it wouldn't be nice jumping that bike off there for real. I'm sure Arnie could do it. He was one of the strongest guys in the world at that time. It would be hard just in terms of stability. I mean, Arnie's on that big bike, so it's quite a stable bike anyway. And then you see, as soon as he pulls the kid off, the kid's bike is straight to the floor and goes under the back of the truck. Pretty realistic. I would say that when they did that for real, they'd have been on a rig, so the bikes are held in close proximity together. They haven't got to worry about the controls or the speed or the balance of the bikes. And he's just got to concentrate on his action of lifting the kid and bringing him on. I know Arnie does ride, and it looked like he was riding in some of the shots there. He's on quite a stable bike. It's a pretty flat road. I'm guessing they got as much as they could coverage with the actor, with Arnie himself. And then in between, the stuff where you don't see his face and everything, then they'll be using a stunt double for sure. How you film a chasing kind of depends on the elements involved in it. It's quite straightforward. It would be a combination of practical in-camera moves, actors riding the bikes, stunt doubles riding the bikes, and then various special effects elements in there. A lot does go into the planning of it. It can be so different for each action sequence. Next up, The Great Escape. This is a pretty iconic sequence for a lot of guys. Steve McQueen was one of the first actors that was kind of known to do his own stunts. He was probably better with the bikes than a lot of the stunt guys that were around at that time, and doing as much as he could and as much as the producers would let him get away with, I guess. He was a great rider. That was his real passion, I think, was the motorsports. You can tell he's super comfortable riding that bike. He did all of this riding himself pretty much, I think. Even though that bike is more of a road bike, really. I mean, in those days, they didn't have such focused bikes. They didn't have such highly modified bikes for the different types of racing. They just used to kind of modify themselves. But the ground clearance on that bike wouldn't be great for off-road. But he's doing a great job with it. When you saw him just there and he slid to a stop, you can tell he knows exactly what he's doing. He's using mainly rear brake. That's because he's on a loose surface. And so if you grab a handful of front brake on a loose surface, you're asking for the front tire to go away from you. And anytime the front wheel slips away from you on any motorcycle, chances are you're going to hit the floor. You can afford the rear end to slide a little bit, which he did there. He hit the rear brake, it slid a little bit, and he automatically corrected it with the steering and slowed to a stop without even looking or thinking about it. So although Steve McQueen was, as we said, a very accomplished motorcycle racer, I believe this jump was done by his best friend, Bud Eakins. Again, another great motorcycle guy. I'm guessing that was a decision of the studios. They didn't want to risk Steve himself not being able to complete the movie. But I'm sure he was perfectly capable of doing that himself. That's no mean feat on that bike either. That's quite a heavy bike, short suspension travel. You can see that bike's only got about this far to go before parts of that will be hitting the floor. Next up, Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance. We filmed this in Turkey. This is me doubling Nick Cage on this movie as the Ghost Rider. That was all done practically in camera. So we had another stunt rider and he was on the side of the bike with his arm over the top of the bike. So he's controlling it from the side, trying to kind of hide behind the motorcycle. He rides in as he gets to the point where he wants to slide the bike, reaches his arm over, hits the rear brake with his hand, slides the bike in, stops it, keeps hold of the clutch. I jump on the bike, grab the clutch off him. He stays laid on the floor and I ride out with him laid on the floor and they take him out in post. It was very simple, but pretty effective way to get across riding with no rider. So the bikes we used for Ghost Rider were Yamaha VMAX, real big engine, I think the 1800cc, something like that. Real big powerful bike. They were pretty standard actually. We didn't really change a lot except for cosmetically. The Ghost Rider bike was essentially the same bike, but it was all covered in kind of molten metal and stuff to suit the character, so that when the flames and everything were added in CG, the rest of the bike was all charred up, a little bit melted like that. In the story, this bike's meant to be the kind of possessed bike, so it's riding towards him. In reality, we call it ghosting a bike actually. It's jump off the bike and leave the bike going by itself. Sometimes they can go a long way. You'll see that in MotoGP sometimes. The guys will crash, the rider will get ejected off of the bike and the bike will keep going. The more speed the bike has, obviously, the longer that thing will stay upright on two wheels. It doesn't want to fall over. The inertia just wants to keep that thing going. And so they can go pretty far until they hit something. Obviously, all the fire on there is digital. This is a supernatural story, so we don't have to believe that that bike's actually on fire, really. Although some guys have tried to recreate these things, it's not recommended at all. But you could light those various parts of a bike on fire if you had something superficial on top that you could burn. And we talked about doing that for some shots. But at the end of the day, to make it more consistent look throughout the whole film, the fire was all added digitally. What we do on the bike, it did have LED lights on it, which gives some interactive lighting. So they would form reflections and shadows, and they would be flickering as if it was flames that were creating those reflections and those shadows. Just saves the VFX guys having to put those other elements in afterwards. All the lead up we do practically. As soon as we get close to the vehicle, close enough to make the transfer, we had a bike that was attached to the side of that truck via two kind of real long steel tubes. And so we would stand on that bike, jump up, and then jump across just with a support wire just in case we'd have fallen so we don't get run over by the truck. Quite a leap between the bike and the truck. It has to look a little bit more supernatural. The bike's meant to be driving by itself, so it has to stay standing up. If you were to try and make that jump and kick off of that bike, and that bike was just free riding by itself, probably chances are you'd kick that thing over as you went to jump off it, and you wouldn't make the distance to the truck. Nick Cage was actually a very decent motorcycle rider. We went out riding a couple of times before we started filming the movie, and we had a chat about how much riding he wanted to do and everything, and he was aware that there was a lot of specialist stuff in there. He did a fair amount of riding when he was the Johnny Blaze character, and we actually see his face and everything. As soon as we're the Ghost Rider character, most of that would have been stunt double for sure. Next up, the world's fastest Indian.
Come on, fellas, push faster! Keep running!
That is so sketchy. This, I guess, is the Salt Flats in Bonneville, where they do a lot of the speed testing and stuff, bikes and car land speed records and everything. That looks like a pretty typical kind of vehicle for doing that. They would make the bikes and everything as aerodynamic as possible, so they look like rockets shooting through the landscape there. They would be covering as much of the surface area of that bike as they could in a material to guide the wind around it, to create as little drag as possible, to cut through the air, make as little resistance as possible, and make the bike go as fast as it can with the least amount of power possible. As he first sets off on that bike, you see he has a little trouble balancing, and the guys have to kind of stabilize him. The problem is the bike that he's riding has got like a fully enclosed fairing, so I'm guessing that he couldn't get his legs off to stabilize himself. So yeah, he had the guys there stabilizing him, it looks like, because he wouldn't have been able to easily put a foot down and correct his balance with that big fairing around the side of the bike. This is based on a true story, I believe. So they were using a 1920s bike to try and break the land speed record. I think it's set in like the 50s or 60s. They would have had two or three of the authentic bikes that they'd have restored and stuff for close-up shots. And on the set, mainly, they would have used something a little bit more modern that they would then customize to look exactly as the Indian would have looked, but to give more reliability, you know, modern brakes and stability and stuff like that. Indian is a brand name of motorcycle like Harley Davidson, Honda, Suzuki.
167.921. Mile 2, 167.921.
It seems to be taking him a long while to pick up small amounts of speed here, and I guess that's because the bike would be underpowered compared to modern motorcycles. A modern motorcycle, if you watch MotoGP, something like that, those bikes can get up to 220 miles an hour on the racetrack in a few seconds. But here, this bike would have been geared, so the acceleration on that bike wouldn't be that good, which is why it's taking him a long time to get up to speed there. As any road rider would know, is once you get anything above sort of 70, 80 miles an hour, you pop your head up outside of that screen and you're gonna get severe wind blast. You've got to have pretty strong neck muscles then when you start getting to triple figures of speed to hold your head straight. I see he has no peak on the visor. That's a sensible thing. Anything like a peak, as soon as you put your head up, that would just get caught by the wind, rip your neck back. The stuff he's wearing there, the helmet is pretty basic. Just the open face helmet there, flying goggles and stuff to protect his eyes. These days, guys will wear full face carbon fiber, specifically aerodynamic shaped helmets and stuff when they're doing this type of thing. So that thing's going around really fast. You imagine the back wheel's going around at 100 plus miles an hour, so the change what's driving that around, so that's doing the same speed, and then anything that touches is going to start getting rubbed away pretty quickly, you know. Can't believe he's riding in this gear that he's wearing. Actually, it's like a tweed suit or something. He's wearing. I have full leathers and everything on there. The wind at that kind of speed will just grab hold of anything it can, so everything needs to be pretty tight fitting to you. We call it fishtailing because the shape it makes resembles a fish kind of going through the water. The bike's picking up some kind of oscillation. I guess it's just from the speed now and the wind setting up a vibration in the bike there. When it gets big, we call it a tank slapper. And what's that is where the steering will go from one side to the other and you can't really do anything to control that. It'll just kind of either work itself out, or if you keep accelerating and make the front end light, you can kind of stop it doing that. But once a bike starts doing that, you've got to be really careful what you do. If you just shut the gas, you could almost make it worse, because a lot of the weight will go onto the front and the bike could easily tip over at that. You got to try and keep that bike as straight as possible the higher speed that you go. I totally buy that that would happen for sure. We rode the fastest roller coaster in the world, which is in Dubai, and they give you goggles to wear on this roller coaster, and my friend, another stunt rider, sat right in front of me, and he kind of looked back to laugh, and this thing's doing like 100 and whatever miles an hour, and his goggles were gone like in 2 seconds. The second he turned his head, the goggles were gone. So I totally buy that his goggles would fly off if he popped up from behind that screen there.
What is it? 201.851.
I've probably only done sort of 180, 190 miles an hour. It's hard to say what would happen at 200 miles an hour in this type of old-fashioned bike and the old-fashioned open-face helmet. No, nobody would do that now for sure. They'd have a lot more protection from the wind than just a pair of goggles. You'd certainly have a visor on, and for me, if I was thinking about doing anything like that kind of speed, even with a visor, I'd probably tape it down, because sometimes a little crack in your visor can catch the wind and rip that thing up even at 70 or 80 miles an hour. When I've seen these land speed records bikes crash before, they tend to barrel roll a lot. The problem is then that when you crash, you're part of the bike. It's like being in a bobsleigh almost. To outsiders, if you're looking at that, it almost looks like he's riding on snow, and you would think, oh, that'll be fine, you know, but it's salt and it's really abrasive. But at 200 miles an hour, that would go through your first layer of clothing pretty quickly, and so you'd want some protection under there. I don't think he even had a scuff on his helmet, which is yeah, he's definitely got away pretty lightly. I've seen guys get pretty ripped up from a lot slower speed crashes than that on the salt flats. A lot of the guys that race the drag bikes and the drag cars, in order to stop the bike in as short a space as possible and keep stability, they'll have like a parachute that they deploy that comes out of the back of that thing, and it literally catches the wind, provides a load of resistance, and just drags the bike backwards and slows it down from the back like that. So I guess that was his plan, was to deploy the parachute. He never got that far, but that's tends to be what they do in the drag racing world. Next up, Easy Rider. Variety of head protection going on. It looks like the actor's riding for real. Harley choppers, stretched out front end, big ape hanger bars. These bikes are made for straight roads. They're made for the United States. I think the ape hanger thing's just a look and just a cool thing. I have ridden a couple of those for shows and stuff, and I don't find it the most comfortable. I'm not sure about the advantages of it. It must just be a look thing, because I like to feel part of the bike, and I like to have the bike underneath me and everything, and have the controls in here and tight to me. But this is a pretty chilled out position, I guess. So that's totally the kind of thing you would do when you're out cruising with your friends. You'd be goofing around and making different shapes on your motorcycles. What's cool as well is when he goes to get down from the bike, you see that he puts both feet back onto the seat first, and then he kind of jumps down at the same time. That's because obviously on a motorcycle, you've got to think about the stability. You can't just step on one side and then the other side. That bike could be all over the place. So you always try and keep your weight in the middle. So he'll kind of step into the middle of the seat and then jump back down. So yeah, you got to think about these things. This type of bikes, these choppers and customs and that, there's a real kind of a group of people that are into that kind of culture, and they like the bike gangs, and they like to go on meets and hang out and stuff, and it's quite a big thing in the States and in the UK. For me, I like sports bikes. I like aggressive riding and that kind of thing, but this is more about the social side, going out, meeting up with your buddies, taking a ride out somewhere, you know. But in the States, this was a big thing, and that kind of lifestyle, the open road that went with it. So thanks so much for watching these clips with me. It's been great fun. See you next time.